the reason I'm showing you this is because I wanted to show you what a subdivision surface will do to these objects, so that way, if you see it happen, then you could sort of plan for how you could go from there. So when we're talking about the subdivision surface object, we've talked about it from the very start of the semester as an object that you can pull out anytime you want to try and smooth out your object a little bit more. So I've shown you guys in like primitive settings and inside of spline settings where you can go and you could adjust like when it has an option for segments or it has an option for subdivision, where you could change those numbers to smooth it out. Now sometimes if you need to make those numbers very large, or you don't want to have to go into the object settings itself to adjust it, that's where a subdivision surface can come in and do that function for you. You could turn it on and off, so it's a little bit nice sometimes to have the smoothing of the geometry as its own separate object, and then you can toggle it on and off so that way if you're having trouble with like say the performance of your machine, it's nice to be able to turn it off and then turn it back on when you need it. It's nice to be able to work with the low poly and then have the subdivision surface as like a finishing tool. And that's what a lot of people start out using it as, is a finishing tool. So they're modeling with other techniques. Say they're using spline modeling, or they're using polygonal modeling, or you're using deformers to model, and you're going all the way, you're like 90% of the way, and then you're like, okay, well, I've got the majority of the shape, as you see with my two examples here, and maybe I'm just like, okay, well, when I render it, you know, maybe I'm happy with the way the button looks here. Maybe I just wish it was a little bit smoother somewhere else. And then I can look at my bigger knob here and say, okay, well, I can see that that's obviously not as smooth. And there's some angular edges instead of this being a nice round surface for the circle. So when you get to that point when you're modeling, you might be like, okay, well, now what are my options to try and make this smoother, which would be obviously, in our case, we need to add more polygons, and that means we need to make the object, you know, a little bit heavier, or sometimes a lot heavier when we're talking about calculating and rendering. So at this point, what can we do to adjust that? Okay, so you can use a subdivision surface, or you could go to the object settings. Like in this case, this is a loft, and what I did was I have a couple of splines here that you see, and I just lofted. Okay, I lofted the shape. I have edges close together to create bevels up here, and then I have some, obviously the wider areas that I have to make the shape itself, the general shape. So if I want, I could come down here to the subdivision surface settings for the loft itself. I have subdivision U and V, and I could pump those up if I needed to. And you can see now I've gone from 20 to 209, and it looks a lot smoother. Okay, but sometimes this is a guessing game. Sometimes you don't want it to be actually part of the object because you do want to be able to turn it on and off. So you might pull out a subdivision surface. Okay, so I've renamed mine here, but if I check it on, you'll see that this is what it looks like now with the subdivision surface. So this is off. Okay, this is on. Okay, and this shouldn't be a mystery. You guys have been using the subdivision surface over the last couple of weeks here and there for things that we needed to smooth out. Okay, so with a simple thing, it's very straightforward. It usually does a good job. It smooths things out. You can see here it adds just enough polygons around the edge here. And I have my display, I have line mode on, garage shading line, so you can see where my actual polygons are. And this is what it does when I turn it on. This is how many it cuts it up into. So what the subdivision surface does at its core is it takes the geometry that you already have, like this, and it divides it. Simply, that's all it does. So at the core then, what that means is that the geometry has to be good for the subdivision surface to do a good job. Okay, so if there are some things in your actual model that are not going to divide well, the subdivision surface is not a magic wand. It will not be able to divide it cleanly or nicely, and that's where you'll see problems happen. So when you have quads, which is what we call these little polygons that you see here, that they're four-sided, that's the goal. Like if you can have nice uniform geometry that's split up into four-sided shapes, they don't have to be like squares or rectangles, they could be like parallelograms, but they do have to be four-sided. That's what we would call a quad. And when a subdivision surface sees that, it just can simply divide it. Okay. Now what I want to point out to you guys is up here, if you see the cap of the loft, that's what this is, the cap up here, you can see that there are no lines on it. Okay. And the bottom is the same way. And that's not a mistake. What's happening there is it's a giant n-gon. Okay, and I think you've heard me mention this word before. An n-gon is like a polygon. The n of n-gon is, you would put any number in there that you have. So it might be like an 8-sided polygon, essentially. It means that it has more sides. So it's not limited to a specific number. It just means that it has a lot more. So this is not a 4-sided shape. It has a lot more points than you would see that this has, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's not the same type of polygon that this is. So what that means then is the subdivision surface looks at it and it tries to divide it further than what the original piece of geometry was. So this is just one big multi-sided polygon, and I'm saying polygon, but it's you know, it's an n-gon is the technical term. Okay, this is what the subdivision surface does to it. So you see, it tries to divide it into as many 4-sided quads as it can, and then it starts getting to triangles when it can't make the 4-sided quads anymore. Okay, now for this particular shape, this is fine. See, when it renders, it looks fine, everything's okay, and that would be, you know, the point that I would say, like for students at this point, they ask if n-gons are bad. And n-gons, I don't want to say that they're like an evil thing that you should avoid at all, you know, at every juncture that you're working. They serve their purpose. If they divide and they don't cause you trouble, if you're not worrying about animating this to like morph and move, then you should be okay with this. So now that I've modeled this knob, it's smooth, it looks nice, I'm not getting any sort of weird distortion here. So I would say that this is okay, this scenario, even though that these are not exactly uniform, what's happening up here and down here the same way. But it's not causing me any sort of problem. It's not a character that I'm trying to rig. It's not like clothes that I need to wrinkle or something like that. So this is okay. I would say this is fine, and it's an n-gon, and it's being divided further. So, you know, this does the job, and I wouldn't worry about it. Okay. Now, what you can do is, if you go to the subdivision surface, it has very little options. The only thing it has is it has a type, and you could switch to different types if you want to see what they look like. But the default is Catmull-Clark n-gons, and again, it's trying to like deal with n-gons because that's usually where it will run into trouble. Okay, and then you have the subdivision surface editor and renderer. The default is 2. Okay, so what this number means is how many subdivisions the object is doing. So if you want more, you can up them. Okay, one is the editor and one is the renderer. So if you want to preview here a lower number than what you're rendering, you can do that as well. Okay. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have the editor be higher than the renderer, because that means when you preview it here in like perspective camera, it will be higher quality than what you actually render. So if you're not sure, you can keep them the same number. Okay, you can see as soon as I put it up to 3, I've got way more polygons. And then if I do it again to 4, you can see the darker my surface is getting, the more subdivisions there are. Now, at a certain point, if it's going black, okay, that means that there's so many that we can't even see them, that they're so tiny. I would definitely, you know, stay. The nice thing about the subdivision surface is that this is, you know, you could always come here and adjust. I would definitely say to stay on the more moderate side with it. at a certain point it's going to top out. So if you're just trying to make the numbers higher because you're just trying to get it smoother, and then the numbers are going higher, but you're not seeing any significant amount of smoothing, then I would definitely say the subdivision surface has maxed out. It's not a magic wand. If your geometry is not going to lend itself to being split up evenly, then the subdivision surface can't help that. So if for whatever reason I think that this needs to go up, I could put the number up higher and higher and higher, but probably at 3 here, we're not going to see any more smoothing. And now that I'm at 5, this just means it's going to take longer to render. It's not actually going to help me. And at a certain point, you could make it so high that you crash it. Okay? But this particular object had good bones. It was simple enough, so everything it was okay when I put in the subdivision surface. I'm going to show you what happens to this guy over here. Okay, so this guy's different. It's a spline. Okay, so I'll show you. It's a spline that I drew, that I put into an extrude. Okay, and so now that it's in an extrude, I've got a similar situation to what's happening here, but it's a different shape. So you can see up here the extrude has definitely made some quads. Okay, I have some irregularity happening over here where I've got some bigger ones, and then I've got this very skinny one that's sort of out of the a little bit out of the group there. This is the skinniest one in the middle. The other ones are not quite that same size. And then on the outside here, I do have a giant cap end-on. Just similar to what we're seeing here, okay, but that's round, okay? This one is a more irregular shape, okay? So this is what happens now. I'd say, okay, I want it to be a little bit smoother. It's pretty smooth, but say I just wanted to smooth out this arch a little bit more and see if a subdivision surface will help me. So I put it into a subdivision surface, and this happens, okay? Which if you were just modeling and you were hoping to be done, and now you're looking at it and you're like, what is this mess? What am I going to do now? That can be sort of an overwhelming feeling and might induce a little bit of panic. And you can see here that it does render like that. It is truly a mess. Okay, so what has happened is the subdivision surface is trying to divide it, and then it's running into issues where it has more points. Those points aren't lining up cleanly, so you can see like you get this sort of webbing effect where the subdivision surface is stretching, like it's stretching from one side to attach to the other side. You can see down here that it seems like it was sort of okay for the cap, but it did a lot of extra smoothing. So now it's not a rectangle anymore. It's curved. So now you've got two problems. This is not the shape that you intended, and this is distorted and all twisted. So those are sort of the two scenarios you might come into contact with when you're using a subdivision surface. I'm not sure if anybody has run into this particular problem in our class. Considering that nobody has mentioned it, I would take that as saying that nobody did see this nightmare. But whether you did and you didn't know how to fix it, or whether this is new and you're like, oh my God, that's not what I thought was on the horizon, this could crop up as you're going forward. And if you're making like a little character and you just want to smooth it out after you've modeled it, you want to be able to know what to do if the subdivision surface does this to you, as opposed to doing this nice expected result where it just smooths it out, and instead you end up getting this nightmare here. Okay, so I'll talk to you a little bit about how you can fix it. Mainly what I want you guys to understand today is what's happening, so that you understand the underlying problem, and that can sort of help you, one, avoid this problem in the first place, and two, when it happens, you can kind of try and go in there and try to work with what's happened. If that's the solution that you have. If you really need to try and get a subdivision surface to work, how can you approach fixing this. Okay, in the grand scheme of things, I would have to try and fix the cap here because the irregularity of this shape and then dividing it from this one big chunk into you know smaller polygons from the one big n-gon, that's the issue that you're seeing here, and then like all of these points from the extrude are not lining up with anything here. Once I have more of those points, they don't know where to go, so that's why you've got that weird piece here. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example with just looking at caps, and then I'll show you how you could use your modeling tools to work with it, and in that vein, how you could be using it as a modeling tool. Okay, so I'm going to switch over from this file to this one that I prepared for you guys to look at. Okay, so this is, I'll turn off my subdivision surfaces. These are three of the exact same object. Okay, and you'll see here that it is Motext. So all I did was I took a Motext object. It's the letter T. Okay, and the only thing that's different between the three of them is that I changed the caps. So if you go to caps, you always have this option down here to change the type for the caps. So any object that has caps, like we just saw, if I switch back to this just temporarily, the loft has caps. Okay, loft comes with a caps tab, and so does an extrude. An extrude comes with a caps tab. So by default, when you make objects like this, whether it's a primitive like a cylinder, or whether you're using a spline and you've got an extrude or a lathe or a loft or a sweep, when you have caps, the default, if you go down here to cap type, is set to n-gon. That's usually, when you have trouble with your subdivision surface, that's usually the one of the likely places you'll see an issue pop up. The loft here was fine, but the extrude was not. And that's because the cap is set to n-gon. Okay, and that just means that it doesn't care. It's going to make one big polygon to cover the shape. And if it needs to do that with 12 sides, it will do that. Okay, if not, and it could do it with 4, then that ends up being great as well. But sometimes that's not the case.